Well, good morning, good afternoon to those of you who are joining us either from North America or from Europe. Bonsoir. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you on behalf of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy here to today's webinar on a timely topic, indeed, as NATO leaders are currently meeting in Madrid to discuss the future of Western unity, whether we can expect this to persist over the weeks and months ahead in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine, or whether we can expect divisions perhaps to reemerge in the wake of the NATO summit that we're seeing right now. And for this topic, we are very grateful to have with us four excellent panelists, some of the best to discuss this topic, and they are, in no particular order, Tara Varma, who is Senior Policy Fellow and Head of the Paris Office at the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR. Merci d'être avec nous, Tara. Michael Mazarr, who is Senior Political Scientist at RAND Corporation in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us as well, Mike. Michael Kimmage, professor of history and at the Catholic University of America, as well as visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, GMF, also in Washington, D.C. Michael, thank you so much for being with us as well. And last but certainly not least is Roland Paris, Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. For those of you who are not familiar with IPD, we are a relatively young North American think tank, which is dedicated to examining questions of foreign policy in an evolving international order from an angle that tends to privilege a perspective rooted in realism and restraint. So the Western response to this war began with a highly coordinated and far-reaching sanctions package. However, that unity seemingly began to disintegrate thereafter with disagreements over Russia's energy imports, for example, among EU member states, as well as major differences in tone over how soon Ukraine could integrate into the West, particularly into the European Union, and whether the West should push as well for a peace settlement in the context of the current war. However, now things appear to be back on track. In short order over the past couple of weeks, we've seen candidate status for Ukraine granted by the European Council. We've seen a relatively optimistic G7 summit just a few days ago in southern Germany, and now NATO leaders are meeting in Madrid to agree not only on a new strategic concept, but also to clear a path as of last night with the recent memorandum of understanding to welcoming two new members into the alliance, Sweden and Finland. So, Roland, my first question is to you. In your view, has the West now definitively righted the ship? Or in your view, is this just an instance perhaps of passing unity or symbolic unity with divisions between allies and partners likely to reemerge in the near future? And you're on mute, Roland.
Thank you. Yes. First of all, thank you for having me on this panel. Something significant has shifted. And the results of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think, will have a lasting impact on the way that the West views not just Russia, but its own security arrangements. And nothing is more visible than the decision by the German government to change its policy in such a fundamental way with regard to defense spending and how it's orienting itself as a defense partner within NATO. But of course, the almost certain joining of NATO by Finland and Sweden will be a durable result of this, as well as the forward deployment of forces, including by Canada on the eastern flank. And I expect that this economic war will continue for some time between Russia and the West. So I think that many of the changes that we've seen are in a sense baked in, but that doesn't mean there won't be disagreements among allies. Of course there will be. I mean, there's going to be up to 32 members of NATO, and of course the European Union has its own interesting decision-making processes, and we will see a election in the United States this fall in 2 years. So there'll be a lot of events that will take place, and there will be disagreements for sure, but I don't think there's any going back to the status quo ante. I think we've entered a new era right now.
Thanks very much, Roland. Tara, could I just shift over to you? This unity among EU member states has been a major impeding factor towards a more effective European Union foreign and security policy over recent years. However, in recent months, we have been appearing at least to see some steps in the right direction. We've seen the strategic compass come out recently, adopted back in March, which is the first common threat assessment among the 27 ever, as well as candidate status for Ukraine and Moldova, which is symbolic, but nonetheless an important decision. So in your view, are these moves actually significant when it comes to securing a more unified European strategic culture among the EU's member states, or are these largely symbolic moves?
Hi, Zach. Thanks a lot for having me too. I don't think these decisions are symbolic. I think they are quite strong. Honestly, the Russian invasion happened almost to the day 4 months ago now. It would not have been possible without the Russian invasion to envisage Ukraine and Moldova getting granted candidate status to accede to the European Union. So it's been actually quite a Copernican revolution. The way the EU has reacted, activating the European Peace Facility, providing lethal weapons, financial aid, material aid to Ukraine to the tune of 2 billion euros, in addition to the help that's been provided individually by a number of European Union member states, is unprecedented, unheard of. If you had asked me 6 months ago if I thought whether it would be possible, my answer would have been no, and I think I'm quite an optimistic person. The changes that have been happening are massive. What is certain is that the European Commission, the European Commission manifesto when it came to power in December 2019 was that it wanted to be a geopolitical commission. So there was an ambition there. And if you look at the way the EU has been working ever since the beginning of the COVID crisis, there has been quite a change there too. The capacity for the EU to think about creating common strategic medical stocks, buying vaccines in common, being able to export those vaccines to a number of countries and regions in need, was a way for the EU to project its power in a way that it hadn't done before. And if you look at the health sector, it's not even one of its competencies. So I think the past 2 years have really shifted not only the EU's willingness to act, but also its capacity to act. And we're seeing this today. A lot can be improved for sure, but I think we should commend the EU for what it's done, because it's been quite incredible.
Thank you very much, Tara. Over to Michael Mazarr, because part of the question surrounding the EU's ability to act collectively has to do with the role that the US has historically, and certainly in this crisis, played in rallying allies and partners together. So the renewed sense of purpose in NATO right now that accompanies this US role in bringing allies together seems to be occurring alongside a growing consensus in Washington that the future of great power competition lies in Asia. And this seems to be increasingly a bipartisan consensus that China is public enemy number one now. So, given the importance of this global power shift from west to east, from the Euro-Atlantic to the so-called Indo-Pacific, in your view, how durable is the US commitment to supporting both EU and Ukrainian aims, not only in this war, but perhaps beyond as well?
I think the durability is not so much, in my view, a focus of the contest with China for resources as it is the general political upheaval in the United States and what we may be seeing in the next midterms and what the House and Senate, and then after that, 2 years after that, what the White House looks like. I think that one of the lessons of this is that international security is in some ways indivisible, and that it is simply not possible to say, to the United States, to say we are focusing on China to the exclusion of other problems. The United States still has to be very involved in the Middle East. There was just an announcement that the US had been meeting privately with Israel and a number of Arab governments on ways of dealing with regional security issues. That sort of thing's got to continue. The United States faces threats and challenges in these other areas. The most substantial US historical, cultural, and value connections are with Europe. And I think most Americans who think about this realize that we've learned the lesson twice, that walking away from Europe and expecting everything to go okay hasn't worked. And so the United States is not, I think, thankfully, going to try that again. So I don't think that the pivot to Asia is a major threat to a continued focus on Europe, especially when you look at what the United States is actually doing. Some of the military reinforcement measures announced in the last day or so are significant, but they don't require a commitment of the majority of any of the US military services. The bigger issue is what happens in US politics. There are obviously members of sort of the populist elements of both parties that are much less interested in America's global commitments. And specifically, some of them have indicated great skepticism over U.S. commitment to Ukraine and U.S. commitment to NATO. So if I were to worry about the sustainability of the U.S. commitment to Europe, to these initiatives that are underway, that's what would worry me, not the fact that we're going to forget about Europe as we rush to, confront China.
If I could just follow up with you, Mike, on that, just to present a little bit of a counter argument. There are certainly those who are arguing right now that Europe has clearly demonstrated its latent capacity to be able to balance against Russia on its own throughout this crisis. And now should be the time for the United States not to reaffirm, its commitment to Europe, which would only encourage Europe to continue to be a bunch of free riders. Now's the time for a more orderly divorce rather than a disorderly divorce somewhere down the road. Why do you disagree?
I disagree very strongly with that. I mean, I like Emma Ashford a lot. I thought her op-ed in the New York Times was very well presented. I just disagree entirely with it. I think that case presumes, in a way, what it's trying to prove, which is, what is the reason for U.S. disengagement? Do we risk war by being engaged? The free rider argument has been debated endlessly in the academic literature, and there's a bit of evidence for it, but I think the fundamental response is the United States has vital national interests in the security of the European continent. We gain tremendous international influence and power from our partnership. Another piece of the new NATO concept that's 2 big paragraphs on China, which reflects some of the strongest language indicating that NATO is concerned with some of China's more aggressive moves. That is a very significant signal that the United States has the alignment of its European allies. I think U.S. leadership is still important. Talking to folks who've been involved in the making of policy, in the evolution of European thinking after the Russian invasion, there was a lot of self-generated European opposition to the war and commitment to do something. But the United States played, as it often does, a critical role in kind of gathering all that together and focusing it and providing leadership. I think this is potentially a good example of a new version of American leadership, which is first among equals rather than primacy. That's a transition we can and should make. But the transition to abandoning Europe, pulling out of NATO, and just telling Europe to go on its own, in my view, there is just absolutely no case for that extreme of a move.
Gotcha. Thanks very much, Mike. Let's bring Michael Kimmage into the discussion now, because you've written a great deal about the role of the West in global affairs as an entity, as opposed to the more disembodied ideological notion of a liberal international order, for example. So in your view, do you see this war as strengthening the resilience of the West as a concept, as a civilizational concept, as a geopolitical concept, et cetera? Or rather, do you think that it stands perhaps to undermine some of the West's long-term foundations?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, and it's a privilege to be among such a distinguished panel. Zachary, let me make 3 points in response that don't perfectly align with each other. They're a little bit contradictory, but I think that captures the complexity of the present moment. I think when it comes to geopolitics, to echo points that have already been made by Tara and Michael, I think it's evident that the West is quite a bit stronger now than it was 5 months ago. There's a clear sense of purpose. There have been lots of commitments from the German, the US, and other governments to strengthen the NATO alliance, and I'm sure Sweden and Finland will bring important new assets to the alliance, which now, once they join, will sort of have potential dominance of the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, which is a real sort of structural and fundamental problem for Russia going forward. So that, in a sense, is the good news. I think that on the geopolitical front, there's more to say, though. The dilemma is not so much capacity, and it's not the defense of the alliance itself. I think that NATO will excel at doing. The dilemma is what to do in Ukraine. So there are a lot of statements made about supporting Ukraine. There's a lot of material support flowing, and that, in my view, is only to the good. But Russia has much clearer aims at the moment than the West does in Ukraine. And it's not clear that the articulated sort of rhetorical aims that the West have are achievable: a return to the pre-February 24th borders, or a complete expulsion or defeat of Russia. I mean, different analysts have different ideas in mind, or different policymakers have different ideas in mind, and that's very, very hazy. And that, I think, is potentially a significant problem. Third point I would make, since you mentioned the word civilizational, I don't think that the West has found its story yet. I'll just make two quick background points. In the 1940s, the story was the defense of Western Europe, a very discrete piece of territory behind the Iron Curtain. That was a pretty clear mission, and NATO was good at that. In the 1990s, it was a much more expansive idea for NATO, that it would bring peace and democracy really to the Eurasian continent almost, potentially to Russia down the road, but certainly to sort of Eastern and Central Europe, and with Turkey perhaps down to the Middle East. You had the out of area operations in Libya and Afghanistan. That is clearly not the frame anymore. So what's the story now? It's dealing with Russia and China in some ways, but it doesn't have a lot of cultural resonance to me. It doesn't have a lot of clarity. And I think that takes us back, I'll conclude on this point, to the worry that Michael has about domestic politics. If you can't tell the story of what you're doing in very clear terms that are not just about airplanes and assets and soldiers, you're going to have problems perhaps with domestic politics. And that's something that each of the NATO leaders has to do better on. It's not where it should be in terms of narrative storytelling and sort of cultural or civilizational purpose.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. And this is a great segue into a question for Roland, which has to do with the resilience of, whether you want to call it the West or the liberal international order, about which you've written a great deal. How much can we actually expect the West to be able to win hearts and minds in the global South as a result of this war? There is a narrative that's very much present in the global South that the food crisis that we're witnessing right now, the economic crisis, is the cause of Western sanctions. Of course, this does not paint the entire picture, but this is a narrative that has very much taken hold. And this focus that we seem to have in Western policy circles of talking a lot about, the revitalization of the West, the future of the West, the role of the West in the world. It's hard to be so focused, it seems, on the West and actually to demonstrate clearly that we actually care about, the global South's priorities. So do you risk, even if there's a revitalized West to a certain extent as a result of this war, do we risk losing the global South to a certain extent? In net terms, could that be a relative loss?
So let me answer your question by beginning to respond to something that Michael just said about the West's, about the story, about the purpose, about the narrative surrounding what the West is doing right now. And I think that I wouldn't entirely agree that the story is amorphous. I think that the story is in effect been provided by Vladimir Zelensky as he's put a mirror up to us and said, who are you and what do you stand for? And, and that has had the effect of, I think, diminishing in some ways some of the populist appeal in some Western countries, especially those who are kind of accusing their democratically elected leaders or government systems of being tyrannical or the like. We're facing a very clear example of a brutal tyranny and of a very brave, courageous defense on the part of the Ukrainians. The problem is, though, that the narrative about democracy and democratic systems, which I think has had a galvanizing effect, in addition to just the sheer security threat that Russia poses, that narrative does not necessarily play that well in the global South, as you suggest, is coming back to your question. That rallying democracy is something that has been used many times in the past, and in some ways that narrative has been tarnished by the memories of the invasion of Iraq and torture and the like. And not to mention fitting into a much longer story, which is still a sensitive one, of colonialism in parts of the developing world. So, on one hand, you see the West, I think, is becoming galvanized around a recommitment to democratic values, but appealing to that developing world, I think, requires talking about rules as opposed to necessarily about democracy and sovereignty and an invasion of sovereignty and essentially the rules that we all operate under. That's something that's much more, I think, likely to be an effective message, as well as dealing with the bread and butter issues, food, investment, health, And we haven't really done a very good job of that through the course of the pandemic.
So if I could play devil's advocate here for a second, putting aside, of course, the need to focus more on food, investment, health, and the like, when we talk about the rules-based international order and that the current conflict in Ukraine is the rules-based international order itself that's at stake, a lot of countries in the global south look at that and say, well, number one, actually, no, this is just a dispute between Russia and the West. We're not sanctioning Russia, so you guys have to resolve this for yourselves, and Europe's problems are not necessarily the world's problems. This clearly could, pose an issue, obviously, for the West to be able to demonstrate its resilience, its appeal at the global level. Do you see that potentially, as an issue at all? And of course, the second thing that people in the global South would think about in this context is, well, yes, you talk about rules, but we've seen the United States violate the rules or bend the rules, break the rules on numerous occasions. So, is this term rules-based order actually viewed neutrally in the rest of the world?
Well, I'm not sure if I used that term. I talked about sovereignty. And there's, very few countries in the world are more sensitive about sovereignty than those that have had their sovereignty questioned, challenged, or undermined. And those that gain their sovereignty through independence movements, post-colonially, et cetera. So I would be inclined in the diplomacy to set aside the kind of $50 phrases and just talk about the reality of one country having brutally invaded another and killing their civilians. And yes, a lot of countries are fence sitting right now, and maybe they won't be persuaded to, join in actions to punish Russia for its behavior. But at the same time, honestly, it does shift the onus onto Russia to explain what the hell it's doing.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Yes, Michael, you wanted to come back in.
I just wanted to respond very briefly to what Roland said a moment ago about the Western narrative. And I think he's absolutely right that Zelensky has done a lot to articulate it. And that's resonated quite a bit with the populations of the US and Canada, Western Europe, and elsewhere. But I think it remains a kind of ambiguous thing because the West is not fighting in Ukraine. It's supporting Ukraine through provision of arms, but it's not directly involved in the conflict. In the summer of 2020, there was a lot of verbal support given to democracy in Belarus, but that's completely off the table that the West would have a real sort of stake in that country's political future. So I think there's an ambiguity there that Zelensky is very supported in many ways, sort of emotionally, but there are ways in which Ukraine remains out of the club. And it's not to detract from what Zelensky has accomplished, it's just to speak to the complexity of the overall issue.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Now, I know that Roland only has 7 minutes left before he has to jump off, so let me just stick with you for a little bit, Roland, if you don't mind. Part of what we try to do at IPD is to facilitate discussions between Canadian experts and international experts, just so that the world can get a better sense of Canada and some of the debates that we're having in Canada and Canada's so-called role in the world, as it were. So could you help us understand the role of Canada in this conflict to a certain extent? Beyond the initial round of sanctions that were imposed, has Canada played, in your view, an important role in actively forging sustained consensus among allies throughout this conflict, or has it largely adopted a reactive posture?
I think it's fair to say that Canada has been a good partner to its allies, not necessarily in a especially leading role, although Canada is the so-called framework nation for the NATO battle group in Latvia, which is significant. And Canada, like other allies, has provided weapons to Ukraine, financial assistance to Ukraine. Canada increased its deployment of combat forces to the eastern flank a few weeks ago. Perhaps there'll be more announcements coming out of today's NATO summit. So, unlike in some places, there really isn't any political debate in this country about whether or not Canada should be strongly supporting NATO. It's politically, it's in some ways it's not a matter of debate at all. So for Canada, of course, the challenge will be dealing not just with this recommitment in Europe, but like a lot of other countries, additional defense demands, and they're very costly, including a melting Arctic now facing across the North Pole to a Russia, which is where the relationship is obviously changed, and an Asia-Pacific strategy that frankly is yet to be really clearly articulated by Canada and is badly under-resourced. So on the resources side, I don't think we're anywhere near where we need to be in terms of our investment in our military, which is only 1.3% or so of GDP. And also our investment in our development programs, which have strategic effects, and in our diplomacy. So all of our international instruments, can't be treated as luxuries anymore, and they have been by successive governments. Although, last point here, which is the good news, just before this, our panel began, I saw news that Canada is actually expanding its diplomatic presence in the Baltics and other parts of Europe, and it just made a decision to create a permanent embassy at the African Union as well. So there does seem to be a reinvestment in the diplomatic function.
Very true. Although we are a country that tends to have relatively limited resources, and it begs the question, can we have a significant commitment to our so-called North Atlantic actor while at the same time being fundamentally serious about contributing to regional governance in the so-called Indo-Pacific? There seems to be limits to what we can do, and this debate, I'm sure, will emerge as the Indo-Pacific strategy is maybe released later this year towards November. Do you see this as possibly being an issue going forward? Canada being locked into this North Atlantic actor, possibly having its influence in the world's geoeconomic and geopolitical center of gravity, namely the Indo-Pacific, perhaps reduced by virtue of this lopsided prioritization of our foreign policies towards the Euro-Atlantic theater?
Well, I wouldn't see it reduced, but there are trade-offs to be made, and every additional commitment to Europe is something that's not available necessarily for in other roles, for other missions. But I think the broader point I would make is that we, like a lot of countries, are working through our strategy in the Indo-Pacific. It's going to require much more of a strategic approach, bringing together lots of lines of effort, and resources alone aren't enough, but it's a necessary condition to be able to deliver such a strategy along all those elements of the international instruments I was talking about. And so we need to grow the pie in order to divide it among these different missions more effectively.
Gotcha. Okay. Last question for you before you have to run in 2 minutes. Let's
feel
zoom out
bad for
again.
the other panelists here.
Let's just zoom out again very, very quickly, which is unity, in your view, all that it's made out to be among the transatlantic alliance? Because the threat of sanctions and tremendous coordination among allies in the lead up to this war did not stop Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine. Multiple rounds of sanctions which have relied on coordination and unity among Western allies, within the EU, but also transatlantically, and of course, which have been more far-reaching than many observers initially expected. They haven't stopped him from waging this war. So, how important is Western unity in your view going forward? Is there a trade-off between unity and substance, perhaps?
Well, I think that what has already happened has been vitally important in terms of demonstrating the cost that Putin is facing and would face should he extend his interest to other areas. And that's been a concern, I think, especially as his rhetoric has really been more oriented towards a kind of nostalgia for previous periods of Russian or Soviet grandeur. And even the remark about Peter the Great. I mean, I was in Latvia last week, and it sharpens the mind to be sitting that close to Russia in a territory that would clearly fall under the category of lands to be reclaimed according to the Peter the Great model. So I think that what's happened so far has been critically important in terms of drawing a line, how it affects and what the outcome in Ukraine is going to be. I'll leave it to, I suspect there'll be further discussion after I unfortunately have to leave this debate, and there will be disagreements among Western allies. I mean, there always have been, but I think the big point here is that I'm pretty sure historians will look back at this moment as one where there was a kind of paradigm shift away from the post-Cold War, security thinking in Europe and into a new era, which will be bumpy. But this is real, to get at the essence of your question, and also to repeat my answer to your first question. What we've seen is a real shift, but there's a lot of problems ahead, no doubt. And thank you for having me, and I apologize for having to go.
Not at all, Roland. We're very grateful to have you. Hopefully we can host you again at IPT before long, and thanks for your contributions today. Let's bring Tara back into the discussion now and go to another medium-sized country, over to France, where Emmanuel Macron has been viewed as the sort of bête noire in the West for quite some time. He may have righted the ship in terms of consulting more with fellow EU member states over recent months, but there still is this perception that he puts his own vision of Europe sometimes ahead of the interests of allies and partners. So in your view, how fair is that perception?
So I think he probably sees it quite differently. His sense is that there needs to be a European diplomatic leadership that was not really held by anyone, and so he occupied this vacant space. I did say that the European Commission wanted to be a more geopolitical commission, but it doesn't have the exclusivity of being able to lead in terms of European foreign policy. For sure, he has a vision of what France's foreign policy is, and I think he has a vision of what Europe's foreign policy should be. Sometimes they overlap, and I would say this is one of the reasons why there is a sense of confusion sometimes. But I think they are quite different. And you can sense, if you look at his speeches, you can see that these are two different objectives for him. What is certain is that the method he employs are the same for both the French foreign policy and the European foreign policy objectives, which consists basically in what I had called at some point rocking the boat. So he will present initiatives relentlessly on a number of issues, on Libya, on Iraq, on the US, on European defense, on Russia. And it's going to be this massive intake for all European partners. I think there is a bit more consultation now, but there wasn't much consultation at the beginning of his first presidency 5 years ago. He came in with this very strong idea for European sovereignty, which he presented in his Sorbonne speech in September 2017. And I think he was looking at the world, if we position ourselves again at the time, Brexit, the British decision to leave the EU was already over a year old. Donald Trump had come to power in the US, and he had made declarations on the EU, which, sure, were supposed to be taken with a grain of salt, but were quite disturbing for us. At some point, he tweeted that he thought the EU was a foe to the US to the same extent or even worse than China. And so, these are things, when it's the most powerful man in the world tweeting them, you need to take them into account. And there were declarations on, giving a potentially US commitment to NATO, which would have extremely damaging effects on European security. And I don't want to justify what Macron did, because I've been quite critical of him, but I just want to say, let's contextualize again and look at what his starting point was. And he's been pushing for European sovereignty quite a lot. It was not well received, in a number of capitals, in the Baltic states, in Poland for sure, but also in Germany. There was a lot of reluctance to accept the idea of European sovereignty and what it meant, what it covered, particularly because for a number of European Union member states, the transatlantic relationship and the US security guarantee are paramount to the rest. And so for a long time, I would say there was a sense that European sovereignty or European strategic autonomy, which I often use interchangeably, but which are different, would mean either replacing the US or eliminating the US from the equation. Honestly, I don't think that's true. I think there is a sense that the US is going to be more selective in its engagements with the EU, as we've said in this panel earlier. The focus for the US is going to be China. I don't think that's an impression from the European side. This is what our American partners are telling us very clearly. So of course it is the responsibility of Europe to decide what it wants to do in that case, because we also have a number of security threats, a threat assessment that we've agreed in the strategic compass that was published in March and adopted in March, which are that Russia and China are two big threats for Europe, and they are threats, I would say, in slightly different manners than for the US. For us, the Chinese threat for now is mostly technological and economic. And the Russian threat is, of course, a relatively conventional military threat, plus political interferences in our processes. So we need to find ways to answer that. NATO is part of the answer. The EU will not do collective defense, but the EU is part of the answer as well, because the sanctions that have been implemented, the anti-coercion instrument, this Western political unity is something that was also really gathered at the European level. And so this, again, Macron is not perfect, but I think that the fact that he pushed for these topics, which are still quite controversial, did help in Europeans getting together. We've seen it once again since COVID. And if you look at the German coalition treaty, it has the goal of getting to European strategic sovereignty in the agreement. This is something that I would not have guessed possible also 2 years ago. This is now something that's been endorsed basically by the German government. The Dutch government itself talks about European strategic autonomy. So I hope that we have come to a point where we agree that this is an objective that the Europeans have to fight for a little bit. They still have to define what it means exactly, and they still have to decide how they see the future of the transatlantic relationship. Because, of course, what we're following in Paris, but not only in Paris, I would say in all other European capitals, are the US internal domestic developments. And if there is the prospect of Donald Trump coming back to power, or a Republican candidate that would be more or less Trump-like coming as well, we know that European security is not in the top 3 priority of their foreign policy. They're going to be looking at China in particular and at delivering for the middle class. So this is going to mean probably moving away from Europe, maybe moving away from NATO commitments. We don't want to do any science fiction here, but it is good to follow the foreign policy debates, both on the Democratic side and on the Republican side, because Europeans need to prepare themselves in any case for any future scenario. And if it was, if we come to a Trump 2 presidency, things might be a bit more rocky than the first time around for the Europeans. So yeah, they need to be prepared.
Gotcha. Well, this is a perfect segue to bring Michael Mazarr back into the discussion, because midterm elections are around the corner in the United States. And I'm wondering, in your view, what sorts of pressures you think this might put the Biden administration under, right? Will there be pressure from the electorate or from the Republican Party to, for example, pursue sanctions relief towards Russia to alleviate the economic crisis, or perhaps calls for Europe to pay even more for its own defense, perhaps beyond the 2% of GDP benchmark, in your view?
It's very hard to say. I mean, because I think that the dynamics, if you're talking about a Republican control of the House and Senate, the dynamics within the Republican Party are just very difficult to predict. And, there's a certain number of Republican senators and members of the House who I think would very much continue to support the current line. I think pressure on the administration, in terms of negotiations is not, the executive still has the lead on that. I think the one place you would see it potentially is in further tranches of aid to Ukraine. I mean, that may have been part of the motivation for getting a large $40 billion authorization to draw on. But if you began to get a critical mass in the House, for example, that said, we're done spending money on this war and we want to spend it on domestic concerns or other concerns, that would begin to constrain the US hand. I think the other factor is the signaling that it sends to Russia and to some degree China. One of the underlying questions that goes to some of it, what Michael was talking about and Tara, our general discussion is, who has time on their side in this situation. And one of the challenges is, and I think Michael was getting to this, that we can't just indefinitely wait for a diplomatic solution and assume that the longer the time goes on, the weaker that Russia will get. And if there begin to be more signs of political fragmentation in the United States, Russia is going to read that as, we can't get into Putin's mind. Nobody knows what he's actually thinking. I've seen some fairly persuasive analysis from experts that he may well think time is on his side. And if he can wait out the West, it may take a year, it may take a year and a half, but this unity will fragment. And this kind of, a more fractured debate in the United States will reinforce that impression on his side. So it'll complicate things. but I don't think necessarily that it will lead to any immediate collapse of the US position.
Okay, thanks very much for clearing that up for us. And let's bring Michael Kimmage back in the discussion now and sort of sum up a little bit some of these domestic dynamics. We do have midterm elections on the horizon in the US and possibly a new president in 2024. We've got Emmanuel Macron, who has to be focused to a certain extent, keeping one eye on the domestic scene because he doesn't have a parliamentary majority behind him. We've got a situation where Britain is not only outside the European Union, but it's even embroiled in a political and legal dispute right now with the EU over Northern Ireland. Germany, for its part, hasn't exactly made clear what the substantive content of its so-called Zeitenwende is. So, all of this together makes it seem like there's a lot of potential that it's going to be difficult to imbue Western unity with policy substance and with continued momentum. So I'm wondering, in your view, are you worried at all that unity on the Ukraine front for the West may become more cosmetic than substantive, and perhaps even a means of just papering over existing forms of disunity as one of the few sources of unity there actually are, and therefore becomes sort of unity for unity's sake rather than unity for actual policy ends?
I am not worried in the short to the medium term, especially about Europe. I think what you describe, Zachary, are the normal pushes and pulls of domestic politics and the complicated swirl of, sort of EU and individual nation states dealing with the EU. I mean, I think that that's business as usual, and I would be surprised if that weren't evidence. I don't think it really, in some fundamental way, threatens, the German commitment to the larger Ukraine policy, or the French commitment, or the British commitment. I think that's going to be there for several years, if I had to predict. I want to go back to Michael's, or maybe I should refer to him as Mike to distinguish him from myself, to Mike's point about the midterm elections, and just introduce one other note of anxiety. I frankly don't think that if the election is a normal election, it's going to have much effect on Biden at all, apart from the fact that the Republicans are likely to win, and then Biden will become overnight a foreign policy president with a very reduced domestic political agenda. But that, for the issues that we're discussing, may not be the worst of all possible outcomes. But I do think that what one has to factor in with US politics now, it's not a cause of satisfaction or happiness to say this as an American citizen, the system itself has become rather unstable. I mean, we see the January 6th trials, we're sort of learning new things about that. I don't think it's a given that the midterm election just goes off smoothly as it did in the past. And so I think that the risk factor there, when I think of Russia observing, is not that X, Y, or Z politician wins in November. It's that people don't accept the results of the election, that there could be civil unrest. Perhaps Russia will try to contribute to that through an active measure or through disinformation. And, I don't think it's a huge concern. I think the country will survive. There are probably mechanisms in place to deal with that. But it's a question mark. And that's going to be a question mark in every upcoming American election for the foreseeable future. So that's, it's a potential burden, or a real burden, really, for American foreign policy.
Thank you, Michael. Let's bring Tara back, and can we just go back to this question of European strategic autonomy and unpack that a little bit more, and the distinction as well between sovereignty and autonomy, because the term, to a certain extent, appears to have gone by the wayside since the start of this war, right? I mean, the term strategic autonomy appears only once in the strategic compass, and this is, about a quarter of the way through the entire document. So I understand the political climate right now is not necessarily attuned to the notion of strategic autonomy from the United States. It has perhaps been reframed along the lines of sovereignty, which is more focused on industrial capacity, tech, supply chains, rather than hardcore geopolitics. But if strategic autonomy, to a certain extent, at least for the short to medium term, is going by the wayside, and Sweden and Finland are joining NATO, which means that 23 out of 27 EU members are going to be in NATO. So that means that it's a little bit less clear what the EU's value added is. I'm wondering, are these trends, in your view, a net positive or a net negative for the transatlantic relationship in the long term? Because it does certainly look like a relationship of continued dependence to a certain extent, at least for the short to medium term. Do you disagree?
My sense is that it's a net positive, but let's stay for 2 seconds on the definition front. I think as the daughter of a teacher, I think this is something that has always been with me. When in doubt, open a dictionary. I'm not sure that strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty are in a dictionary, but they are in our own, let's say. Strategic autonomy is defined as the capacity to act independently in an interdependent world. That's quite vague, but basically you have three components to strategic autonomy. Autonomy of information, autonomy of decision, autonomy of action. The EU doesn't have autonomy of information. It doesn't have a secret service at the supranational level. It has autonomy of decision in a number of fields, but in foreign policy and security policy, it's getting there little by little. Autonomy of action, I'm not sure that we can say it has autonomy of action either. So I don't think that it fills any of these three components. Strategic sovereignty, if you look at the definitions in the European Union Institute for Security Studies, basically says that strategic sovereignty is also the capacity to act, but it's the capacity to manage the interdependencies a lot more. And I think this is where geoeconomics come into play. It's our capacity to manage our critical supplies, to look at a shifting global environment and to fight for a multilateral order and a rules-based order. So that's quite large. It's, more precise than strategic autonomy, but it's also a different, a more holistic political project. I think both these definitions are useful for the transatlantic relationship, honestly. If you look at what NATO did and what the EU did since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, because also this is the topic of today's panel, the EU couldn't have done what NATO did, and NATO couldn't have done what the EU did. I think we're really in a situation where the two organizations were totally complementary. They worked relatively well together. And this is precisely one of these cases, where redundancy and duplication didn't come in as a factor for discussion. I feel like this is very much a 1990s type of discussion. I think it makes sense for the EU to have some capacities. It doesn't have the ambition to do what NATO is doing. It doesn't have the capacity, but first of all, it doesn't have the ambition to do so. And the economic might, the economic powerhouse that is the EU cannot be replaced by NATO either. These are different issues. And I would take what you said about the entrance of Sweden and Finland, maybe in the reverse order. 23 member states of NATO out of 30 will be also EU member states. That makes, for me, an even stronger case for a European pillar inside NATO, for more political coordination amongst Europeans, for sure. They will need to be a lot more active politically inside the organization, and this will not come easily for other members, such as Canada, such as Turkey. I'm not putting them on the same level, but I think there is a strong sense and a fear from a number of NATO members that this is going to, that NATO will become basically the favored platform for EU-US security cooperation. This may happen, and I think that, there could be some positive elements here for the EU. One of the propositions that was put forward by former MEP Andrew Duff in an op-ed that he penned in Politico a few weeks ago was that this famous European Security Council that we've been talking about now for several years, especially since the Brexit decision, could be a format where third countries such as the UK or Turkey could come into European security discussions, but it could also actually be the favored format for EU-NATO cooperation, because we will need a lot more political structuration of this relationship. The EU will not be able to be considered just as another strategic partnership of NATO. I think this is not possible. The entrance of Sweden and Finland really warrant for a much higher level of political coordination, political decision-making. And I think this is where the EU and NATO are helpful. And even where the EU actually delivered lethal weapons in Ukraine, which could not have been possible, nobody denounced the fact that there was a redundancy with what NATO was doing. I think everyone commended the fact that the EU was finally trying to put its weight in an extremely important topic related to its own security. So I think the EU will not replace NATO. NATO will not replace the EU. These two organizations have proven that they are absolutely necessary to European security. And if, I think I'll let it at that, because I think that's quite a strong conclusion for how we've perceived strategic autonomy and strategic sovereignty in the past few years.
Okay, just a reminder to our audience that our panel is going to conclude at 1:15, so please do stick with us. But I know that, Tara, you have to leave at the top of the hour. So let me stick with you just for a moment and turn to the NATO summit happening in Madrid right now. I'm just wondering, what are you particularly keeping your eye on as it relates to that summit? And are there any key indicators that might, particularly show that the transatlantic alliance has been significantly revitalized despite some persistent political disagreements? And let's leave the topic of the Turkey dispute to the next question, because there's a question from the audience on that, and I'll bring that in just a second.
I was going to go to that, but I will answer them. I think the fact that we stayed on course with the strategic concepts, that fact that there were a lot of political consultations as well to ensure that the strategic concept would be valid for the moment that we're living right now, would be ambitious enough, but would also be able to project itself for the next 10 years, which is, of course, a major challenge. I think there's been an increased coordination between transatlantic partners there. I think the fact that we've been wanting to remain on the same page as transatlantic partners on the outcome of the war in Ukraine has been extremely important. And honestly, we should not underestimate how much effort it took from all diplomatic networks to ensure this unity. And it's, as we've said earlier, it's not unity for the sake of unity. I think there was a sense that we wanted to make sure that we were behind Ukraine, that we would defend, we would help it defend its territorial integrity, and that if we put an end to this transatlantic unity, then actually there is a lot of danger ahead. And you've said yourself, even in terms of European cohesion, it's not been easy to maintain the unity at 27. We've seen the difficulty in getting the 6th package of sanctions adopted, the number of compromise that we had to negotiate with Hungary to make sure that it was on board. It was a lot. And if you look, we almost spent as much time negotiating the 6th package as we managed to get the first 5 packages in. So that was quite something. And there is a fear, of course, that there's going to be a war fatigue. Public opinions in Europe that were very supportive of Ukraine at some point may decide that they are still supportive of the Ukrainian fight for its territorial integrity, but they are also worried of the impact of sanctions on their own purchasing power and their access to oil, their access to just heating capacities. This is a sense of worry that's really been rising very strongly, and to be able to keep the unity momentum on this, to decide together how we can think about, again, purchasing strategic stocks, looking at LNG terminals, to be able to keep this unity in our decision-making process, I think is going to be really important. In terms of the NATO summit, we've seen clearly a strong revitalization, the fact that we're going to go to 300,000 men, the fact that we're seeing a reinforcement of the posture on the East. I would say these were relatively expected decisions, but they are being implemented now. And the announcement that comes at this moment is quite strong. So I will leave the Turkey question then to my colleagues.
Great, thank you. And indeed, this is the question we have from the audience, which is, what are the potential ramifications? And I'll pose this to the two Michaels. What are the potential ramifications of the deal that has been hammered out between Sweden, Finland, and Turkey to facilitate Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO? It was remarked to me a little bit earlier today that this is perhaps the first time in the history of NATO expansion that we're seeing liberal democratic safeguards reduced in order to facilitate NATO expansion rather than locked in, right? Normally, NATO expansion is supposed to be about locking in democratic gains. Here, it looks like asylum seekers and the like might have a little bit of a harder time as a result of this deal. So we've got this. We've also got, obviously the decision that many people are talking about these days on the Roe v. Wade deal, highlighting the fact that maybe the transatlantic alliance is less about values, more about interests. All of that together, are there any potential ramifications of this alliance looking like it's more about interests and less about values? Let's start with Michael Kimmage and then over to Mike.
I suppose, in a sense, we have to accept what follows from calling for a more geopolitical Europe. That, of course, means a greater sense of defensive capacity vis-a-vis Russia, a greater ability to compete, could throw China into the mix as well. There's so many obvious reasons for that at the present moment. But again, go back to a point I made earlier, this is not the European narrative of the 1990s, which was much more rooted in values and democratic processes and a sort of spreading cosmopolitanism. It's not just Turkey that has successfully acted to reduce, as you say, the kind of values commitment of the NATO alliance. I mean, one of the most celebrated countries since the war has begun within NATO is Poland, which is no great beacon of liberal democracy. And Hungary is, its own story. It's not a beacon of liberal democracy, but it's also a kind of an annoyance in some ways to NATO. But I don't think one has to be melodramatic about this. It's not as if NATO is giving up on its commitment to democracy. There have always been complexities. Portugal, as a kind of semi-fascist state, was there at the beginning of the NATO alliance, and that was a reflection of geopolitics and realpolitik then. But perhaps in some of the rhetorical framings, it's just important to be sincere about what the nature of this paradigm shift is, and it's a paradigm shift that's being driven by security concerns. So I think it's very natural that a certain degree, or perhaps even a high degree of realpolitik comes forward.
All right, thank you, Michael. Let's go to Mike now, and then I'll go back to Tara for just one last question before she leaves.
I would just say, first of all, in the post-Cold War era, obviously values has been a very sort of an expanded emphasis on values as a leading component of Western security policy has been there. But we shouldn't forget that from the beginning, NATO and other kind of US foreign policy, certainly in Europe and beyond, has always balanced values and practical concerns. And during the Cold War, the United States had, as we know, very close security relations with lots of non-democracies. And in a number of cases, like South Korea and Taiwan, those worked out very well in terms of the future prospects for democracy. So I think people are getting a little hung up about those things, in part because of the overshoot on liberal value promotion that took place with the end of the Cold War and the US predominant position in places like Libya. And backing off that a bit and taking a more medium to long term, I mean, one of the things that I think we're going to have to come up with in a revised US foreign policy approach is partly the recognition of greater autonomy on the part of friends, allies, and partners, and being willing to live with that. And part of it is finding a strategy for value promotion that does not tie our hands in pragmatic actions that we need to take to preserve the ultimate values of, and I think Roland was getting at this before, and Michael as well, issues like sovereignty and the enforcement of basic international rules, that we could reduce our opportunity to promote those things if we are too sort of theological about our promotion of values.
Thanks very much, Mike. One last question over to Tara to try to sum this all up. So the picture, Tara, that you painted for us was one in which, not only is there going to be greater overlap between NATO and the European Union, but there's going to be more like, in all likelihood, greater coordination indeed between NATO and the European Union going forward. Now, the Russian line for a very long time has been that the EU is little more than an economic arm of NATO. It's two sides of the same coin, et cetera. But as we do see this increasing convergence between, NATO and EU policymaking, I'm wondering where you think that leaves Russia's place in the European security order over the medium to long term. And indeed, this is a question that's very pertinent to French policymaking, given Emmanuel Macron's constant desire to find some sort of place for Russia in Europe. Are we, by deepening this cooperation among NATO and the EU right now, trading a long-term imperative for something that is necessary in the short term, but perhaps closing the door to Russia's eventual return to Europe and creating a binary dynamic on the European continent that'll be very difficult to get out of?
So I was, just to clarify, I was not saying that more EU-NATO cooperation is going to happen. I was saying I'm hopeful that it is going to happen because it would be what would make the most sense. So hopefully it will happen. The role of Russia in the new European security order, I would say, depends a lot on the outcome of the war. It's very hard to, plan on what would happen. Not knowing, and it's not just about who's going to win and who's going to be defeated. Ideally, the situation would be one where the two sides come to the negotiation table, something that Putin has refused to do until now. He's been saying, I think only yesterday, he said that he would come to the negotiation table once Ukraine had capitulated. So, that's not really how negotiations work. But I think we can think of a place for Russia in the European security order once we know how things are. There are a number of scenarios out there. I don't see Emmanuel Macron giving up on the idea of saying that we need to bridge the gap with Russia, and that in any case, Russia is on the European continent. So we will have, if only for the security of Europeans, we will have to find a way to work with Russia. And I think he won't give up on that idea. I don't see him giving up on that. But today it's very hard to see how we do that. And it's very hard to see what the European political committee also that he called for is going to be about, because we're talking about enlargement, we're talking about getting Ukraine into the European family, but we will need, once the war is over, hopefully soon, to reconstruct Ukraine fully, just in terms of infrastructure, to reconstruct the Ukrainian economy, to think about Ukraine also as a regional actor in the European neighborhood. This is going to be quite hard. And again, in an ideal world, this would be done through diplomatic means in negotiation with Russia, so that we associate Russia to this new security order. But I think there have been now multiple offers for the past 15 years for Russia to be included in these discussions, and Russia has refused. So, the dialogue by definition is at least between two parties. I think Russia has been invited repeatedly to that and is not willing to participate. It was saying that it was, scared of NATO enlargement. And I'm not questioning those perceptions, because they were very strong. But the fact of the matter is now, NATO is enlarging, the EU is expanding, and the EU will want to think about its security order for sure. So I don't see Emmanuel Macron giving up on that. I honestly don't see Chancellor Scholz either giving up on the idea that we will have to extend the hand to Russia at some point, but not to Putin's Russia as of today. Things will have to evolve a little bit for us to be able to think of that. You're absolutely right. We need to ask this question because it is essential and existential to Europe, but I can't give you an answer not knowing what the future developments would be.
OK. Merci encore d'avoir été avec nous, Tara, et on se revoit bientôt.
Bye.
Bonne soirée. Thank you so much. Let's go back to Mike Mazarr now. And then there were two. We're into our last quarter of an hour of the discussion. Mike, in your view, do you think that there's a risk that transatlantic relations, going forward are likely to grow a little bit more transactional? Is it possible that the US is going to say to its allies going forward in Europe, okay, we've helped you guys on an issue that was important to you, namely Ukraine. So now, it's time for you guys to get more serious about China and to sort of scratch our back as well. If that is indeed the case, do you see this as sort of a solid modus vivendi going forward for the alliance, or would that be a source of friction perhaps going forward between both sides?
So I don't see that. Yeah, I don't see that as the mindset being, at least in Washington, at all. I mean, I think the situation we've been talking about over the last 4 months has, in so many ways, revolutionized the sort of trajectory and trends of thinking. And I think that the dominant view now is non-transactional, is we're dealing with a set of allies and partners that share fundamental interests and values. And there's always going to be a process. I mean, the United States for years has been saying, we're committed to your security. We want you to be more concerned about what's happening with China and Asia. We want you to be more concerned about cyber issues and a variety of other things. I mean, that dialogue goes on. I think, if anything, what Ukraine has done is to create a moment that has, in Europe, sort of reawakened a number of governments to the idea that more intense security efforts and more intense cooperation is important, and reminded some of the United States of the importance of these alliances and partnerships. So, no, if anything, I think we're at least temporarily partly out of a transactional mindset and into something else. The question is whether that's sustainable given a variety of kind of dynamics we've been talking about.
Let's use these last few minutes to sort of zoom out and think about some of the bigger picture questions. So over to Michael Kimmage. This war right now is likely to end at some point with a ceasefire, but the most likely scenario is probably that most, or at least some, of the main political issues in the Ukraine-Russia relationship will be unresolved. And of course, to say nothing of Russia's place in the wider European security system, which is not something that's going to be discussed at the official level for a very long time in all likelihood. So, what do you make of that picture of Russia-Ukraine relationship that is unresolved, a Russia-Europe relationship that's unresolved? Is that going to limit the West's collective ability to project influence globally beyond its own neighborhood? Will it sort of tie the West down into managing European security, in your view?
You bet it will. I think I would put things, I wish Tara were still with us in the discussion, I would put things much more pessimistically and starkly than I think she did just a moment ago. The West, however we define it, we could put South Korea and Japan and Australia and Singapore into the West for this conflict because that's where they are. The West is in a state of semi-war with Russia. It's not been declared. We don't have boots on the ground, or maybe here and there a few for training purposes, but we don't have boots on the ground. But we're supplying weapons in a way that's much more open than was typically the case during the Cold War. This is not really a proxy war. I would say it's a war. And there's no ambiguity about what side Europe and the United States are on. I think we have to acknowledge, whatever Macron says about dealing with Russia and an eventual home for Russia in Europe's security architecture, that Putin's war aims are extremely radical. And he may well wish to sort of wipe Ukraine from the map, either by conquering most of its territory or just by making life impossible for Ukrainians. And the spillover effects of that in terms of refugees, in terms of a sense of encroaching insecurity in Europe, are already enormous and are going to become larger. So this will be an all-absorbing conflict, I assume, for the Biden presidency from this point forward, and for European countries, even if at the moment it's maybe not quite as dramatic as it was media-wise in the first 2 months of the war. It's going to change everything in Europe, and it's going to demand all kinds of resources and attention of policymakers, and it will last as long as Putin carries forward the war, which could well be for many years. So we're in a terrible, terrible situation. It's not a critique of U.S. policy at all. I think the Biden administration has done pretty well, but we have to remind ourselves, or not allow ourselves to forget how terrible the situation is and how much worse it's going to become.
So, Mike, in that case, can we go back to the very beginning of the discussion we were having? The picture that Michael just painted there was one in which being focused on Europe is likely going to come at the expense of the ability to focus on China. So why not view this as a zero-sum issue or zero-sum choice?
Yeah, I mean, I think every set of issues in foreign policy is zero-sum to a certain degree in terms of attention and resources. I basically agree with what Michael just said. I mean, the one scenario that could shift that a little bit is some version of a ceasefire. I'm not optimistic for the same reasons Michael was just saying. I'm not optimistic of any true negotiated solution because, however far Russia gets before it decides it needs to take a pause and press for a ceasefire, it's going to claim that it's sitting on that territory and is not going to give it up. And of course, we're not going to agree to that. And even people talk sometimes about a possible Crimea deal. I think that's off the table as anything explicit. So the best circumstance you could have is a ceasefire in an ongoing sort of long-term conflict, and a ceasefire that is going to bring Russian demands to remove a lot of, if not all of the sanctions. And that's going to begin to get in, that's going to take this conflict into a new and very uncertain phase. That would at least create a situation in which, if you got a true ceasefire where you don't have Russia still firing missiles into Kyiv or something like that, it would create a strategic pause. It would create a situation where the urgency of the arms flow to Ukraine is somewhat reduced, although there's going to be an interest in continuing that, where the escalation risks are temporarily under control. All of the kinds of initiatives that NATO has talked about would still be in train. But let me just give one example of why I think this is not a devastating zero-sum problem. So the United States has now announced in the last couple of days a number of military initiatives to enhance its posture in Europe. An additional rotational brigade, a corps headquarters, a couple of F-35 squadrons. That's not a tremendous amount of military power. And in terms of the corps headquarters and the rotational brigade, these are forces that, army forces, ground forces, that are not among those that are going to be the most urgently required for any kind of Asian contingency, which is primarily a maritime and air contingency. The bigger draw on US military capabilities, just from that standpoint, is in the force flow that would take place in the event of a larger war. I happen to still believe that a larger war is still extremely unlikely. The expansion of the NATO Rapid Response Force, the increase in German defense spending and other defense spending in NATO is going to make it even less likely. The demand for US forces to be on call to be the immediate response to any Baltic contingency will actually decline a little bit. We've seen some of the limitations on Russian military power. The significant losses they've sustained in Ukraine mean that they are less operationally capable of conducting those kind of things. So as I look at the situation, there's actually less of a zero sum just from a pure military operational standpoint. You have a Europe that is committed to significant increases in defense spending and to an expansion of the forces that could react to any contingency. You've got a little bit more US forward deployed combat power, which enhances deterrence. So again, all of that commitment is not really a fatal threat to the US military capacity in the Indo-Pacific. The bigger issue is the simultaneity problem of if the United States had to respond to two major contingencies at the same time, that becomes a really kind of devastating zero-sum situation. But I think the events of the last 4 months have made that less likely in Europe. And Europe's commitment to enhancing its own defense power reduces the urgency for the United States to respond in a future contingency. And so to me, the larger upshot of this is that, as Michael was saying, not only with European countries, but with Japan, South Korea, and separately, the increasing partnership with Japan on China threat-related issues, the US engagement with its friends and allies is stronger, deeper, and more serious than it was 6 months ago. And the situation in Europe is much less favorable to Russian adventurism than it was 6 months ago, and that is going to remain true for years, if not decades. I mean, Germany alone is going to be spending more than Russia on defense. So that's an environment in which the United States can still undertake a lot of initiatives and do a lot of focus on the potential rising threat of China in a global situation that is strategically now more favorable to the United States and its friends and allies. So that's kind of how I view it.
Thanks very much, Mike. Michael, last question, and if there's time, maybe we can bring Mike in again for one more response. But last question to you. How can we, in your view, stabilize some of the great power conflicts that are likely to emerge in the wake of the disorder that's going to follow this war? Because a lot of people are of the view that, rallying allies and forging Western unity is all well and good, but that to a certain extent might exacerbate existing security dynamics, security dilemmas that exist between the West on the one hand and Russia and China on the other hand. So, given that context, how can this circle be squared? How can we actually focus on revitalizing the West while at the same time taking into account these broader strategic dynamics, the need to have a degree of predictability and stability in an increasingly and rapidly changing world?
Well, I think it's really the question to try to address. And, I think we'll have to balance two priorities that are going to be difficult to balance. I think in the short to medium term, or for however long it lasts, support for Ukraine is of the essence for the sake of European security, also in a sort of humanitarian sense, and for the sake of the broader future, so that the rewriting of rules in the way that Russia is attempting to do is not the new norm, but is severely punished. I mean, I think that that's the sort of self-evident policy of the present moment, and I don't doubt whatever instability there may be in the U.S. or electoral changes there may be in Europe. I don't think that that's going to change. That priority, I think, will be stuck to, and I'm pretty confident of that. The other priority is much harder, but in the scheme of things, as your question indicates, Zachary, not less necessary, and it's to find some way of managing the competition. All I can do as a historian is think back to the Cold War in this case, and it is true that the U.S. honored most of its most important anti-Soviet priorities, but at the same time dealt with Soviet leaders, often in ways that did, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis, minimize certain kinds of tension. I don't think that we're going to get together with Putin and solve the problem of Ukraine, but we can perhaps get back to arms control. We can think of more than deconfliction. I think President Biden should be speaking with President Putin on a regular basis. It's absurd to make fun of Macron for doing that. That's just what responsible statecraft involves, even if it doesn't yield any sort of real or visible results. We should sort of think back to the great summitry and the great diplomacy of especially the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and think of that as a precedent that you really can, in theory, do both. You can have a high level of kinetic conflict, which is what we already have, and at the same time do a kind of serious, sincere, far-reaching diplomacy, because we're still in the nuclear age. We have to remember that circumstance. And I think the Biden administration probably gets that, but they're so focused on the first priority that there's just no time, and there isn't, at the moment, I think, the courage to focus on the second priority.
Well, thanks very much, Michael, and lots still to unpack there, but unfortunately we are out of time. So I just wanted to thank both of you, as well as our other two panelists, for having been with us today. I hope we'll be able to host you again at IPD before long, and this has just been a tremendous discussion. So thank you to our audience for sticking with us. To learn more about some of the rest of our activities that are going on at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, you can go to peacediplomacy.org. We recently have a new paper that's been published by my colleague, Chris Maude, on the so-called woke imperium, which is in a separate project from the one that I work. And so you may find that paper to be of interest as well. So please head to our website, again, peacediplomacy.org, and follow our activities. Thanks so much, and have a good afternoon, good evening.
Thank you, Zach.